Back of the bookshelf. The Higher Life by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. The lights burnt low, and the shadows were deep in the angles of the spacious room, and though there were people there, doctor, nurse, friends, there was no sound except the sighing of the autumn wind as it rose and fell, now a sigh, then a sob, now a faint shriek at the window, like a spirit asking to be let in. And then a hurrying blast, and a flight of withered leaves brushing against the glass. Through an open doorway, one saw the adjoining room, where the distant fireplace shone like a jewel. A room lined from floor to ceiling with books, bound for the most part in vellum and gold. A room so rich in beautiful forms and splendid colouring that it might have been the showroom in a palace, instead of merely the book-room of that well-known member of the Bibliophile Society, old Sir Stephen Stilliard. He was very old, and he was dying. Even the longest journey must come to an end at last. The inn, that inn we have all heard of, where there are always beds enough for the guests, is waiting, with open door, for the traveller whose toil is nearly over. Very toilsome that last half-mile, as indicated by the fighting breath, the labouring chest, for which the lightest satin coverlet is too heavy a burden. A very bad bit of road, that. But then the rest of the journey had been so easy. The chariot of life has hung on sea springs, and has travelled along flowery ways through a smiling country. The man, lying there in the solemn stillness of the death chamber, had inherited a large fortune, at an age when other lads are trying to make ends meet at the university on a scrimped allowance from headquarters, and when the glory of life grows pale before the angry face of a dun. He had taken full advantages of the opportunities for evil which money can buy. He had brought his experience of life in the worst markets, and had learnt to despise and hate his fellow men before he was 30. He had married early and badly, choosing his evil portion with his eyes wide open, because at that juvenile period he liked bad women better than good women. The former amused him, the latter bored him. His children had been curses to him, but he had not allowed them to torment him long. As soon as they had shown what was in them, and were old enough to be turned out of doors, he turned them out. One by one, they vanished off the stage of his life, and were heard of no more. The turning out of doors was like the coming of age in happier families, inevitable as the progress of years. His children grew up and blossomed in disobedience, and ripened for rebellion before they were full grown. He had divorced his wife a month after the birth of his youngest child, a daughter, whom he considered one too many. She, who had been Lady Stilliard, was living in Italy, rich, with money not of his providing. There was no distracted mother to kneel or tear her hair when another son or daughter was shown out of the hall door and warned never to cross that threshold again. At 40, Sir Stephen Stilliard began to think he had sat long enough in the courts of folly and vice. There was very little in the way of well-bred iniquity which he had not tried and enjoyed, so far as that kind of thing may be enjoyable. At 40, he felt older than a rural squire feels at 60, but he looked younger. His mind and morals had been in his own keeping, but his valet and his tailor had taken care of his person. A delusion or two, a few crumpled rose leaves in the bed of vice, had sickened him. he began to seek for other sources of pleasure. The time had come for the cultivation of his intellect. He took to reading the memoirs of men of letters, of great thinkers, of theologians and students. They seemed to him to have been happy, after a humdrum, unexciting fashion, quite as happy as he could ever hope to be after having snapped every string upon passion's 7-stringed lyre. He shut his door upon all his old friends and boon companions. The racecourse, the gambling club, the haunts of marketable beauty knew him no more. He affected a chronic complaint, which showed itself only in the cessation of all hospitalities in that splendid house which had once been renowned for the best dinners in London. He had done with that foolish crew. He began to cultivate his mind, deeply regretting that he had not lived 300 years earlier, when he might have dabbled in the black arts, and tried to discover the universal panacea, or even the elixir of life. All beliefs are dead, he told himself, except a man's belief in his own sensations, his own thoughts. The only world I know is I. Henceforth, I devote myself to the improvement and perfection of the world. His life henceforward was a life of contemplation and study. He became a collector of rare books, but they were books which treated of mind only. In all the volumes that walled in his solitude, there was no place for the historian. Dreams, not deeds, were the subject of his study. There was no impostor so shallow, no theorist so crazed, whose visions and hallucinations he did not find an interest in exploring. He fed upon the metaphysics of the past, upon the mysticism of the East and the West. In Buddha, Plato, Zoroaster, he found the familiar spirits, whose philosophy filled the void in his mind, wearied with outworn pleasures. The man he had been, the old man of active vices, fell away from his new nature like a ragged garment. Life henceforward meant contemplation. He gave himself up to lofty dreams. He, who in youth had been the loudest reviler among an infidel crew, now turned believer, not in the Christian's creed, but in the Platonic dream of a future life. There is some essence here, he told himself, with pale finger lightly touching the high forehead which he had elevated to a temple of thought. There is something here that cannot die. The soul which has fed upon all that is grandest in pure thought will soar upward to a higher life. From sphere to sphere, from phase to phase, the mind that has divorced itself from clay will rise and ripen in the white light of intellect, as the cornfields ripen in the sun. The higher life. As the years crept on, and the dreary close of the decades reminded him how near he was to the end of all earthly things, his belief in that progressive existence grew stronger. Not for him the extinction which the Buddhist deems the culminating reward of virtue. No absorption into the universal mind for him, but an extended and an ever-improving individuality, a mind widening with ever-new powers, and entering into the mighty throng of exalted spirits in that higher life. Plato, Dante, Galileo, Shakespeare, Descartes, Newton, the poets, the thinkers, the scientific discoverers, would all be the sharers in that heaven of exalted intellect. He was dying, on the eve of his 90th birthday. For 50 years he had lived only to think and dream, he who when the century was young had shared in the wildest revels of the Corinthians, the porter-guzzling, watch-beating profligates of the 30s, was dying in the 90s, after half a century of life so secluded that only the booksellers and a few of the oldest among the bibliophiles knew of his existence. Most of the younger bibliophiles believed that he had long been dead. For 50 years his house in one of the older aristocratic squares had looked on the outside like an uninhabited house, although within there was a sombre luxury, an all-pervading splendour unsurpassed in any mansion of the great city. Yet even in his seclusion he could not hide himself from those of his race who thought they had a right to inherit his wealth. The approach of death had opened the door for two of his children, who had pulled up short upon that journey to the dogs on which he started them. A son who had contrived to make his mark at the bar, a daughter who had married well, were in the room tonight. These, by sheer force of their respectability, arriving at the paternal door in neat one-horse broughams, had got themselves admitted. The miscreants, who had failed in life, were kept outside the door. Sir Stephen's butler was far too well trained to listen to the pleadings of a son who came to the door on foot, through rain and mud, in a threadbare coat and broken boots. Or to a daughter, upon whose face and garments appeared the unmistakable brand of a disreputable life. He, who lay there in the shadow of a tall, six-leaved screen, cared little who came or went in that silent room. Sons or daughters were alike indifferent. He had made his will many years before, leaving all he possessed to a learned society, the income to be devoted to the encouragement of psychological science in England and on the continent. Not a sixpence was to be left to his own flesh and blood, or for the corporal wants of his fellow men. He heard the footsteps stealing to and fro over the velvet thickness of the Persian carpet, heard the low voices murmuring about him, as of one who understood nothing. The end was very near, they told each other, and the doctor assented, with his fingers on the fluttering pulse. Yes, the end was near. Do you think he knows me? Asked the bearded man, who had been flung out of that house when the down of adolescence was smooth upon his cheek. No, consciousness has quite gone, answered the doctor. He neither suffers nor understands. The passing spirit heard them and scorned them. Poor worms, clinging to earth, held down by their coarse clay, and by the petty intellect which cares only for sordid things, while his fetterless mind was soaring towards the empyrean, the higher life, the larger consciousness, the world of disembodied intellect, supreme in power to see and understand. He has been a cruel father, said the woman, sitting by his pillow. I thought he might relent at the last, and open his heart to us. I hope he has made us some reparation in his will, said the son. Oh, for that loftier world, where money does not count. He was going there, leaving these sordid creatures to suffer the pangs of disappointed avarice, while his wealth went to widen the dominions of pure intellect, to feed the lamp of thought. Darkness closed over that familiar scene. The voices sounded no more. His spirit had left the clay and its surroundings. High in the unfathomable ether, the winged soul was soaring towards the paradise of the elect. What power in those broad wings! What rapture in that pure atmosphere! Far and far and farther below him lay the great city. He could see the glimmer of its million lamps lessening momently as he winged his way through the fields of air. Oh, the rapture of that wild flight! The unutterable sense of freedom, the joy in every feeling of that exalted nature, whose shape and substance he yet knew not. He only knew the power of the wings, the lightness of the whole being. He is travelling towards the abode of sublime intelligences, Plato, Buddha, Confucius. He will be among them. He will see the divine faces, hear the words of riper wisdom, be with them, and like unto them.
Then, if women are to have the same duties as men, they must have the same natural education.
But suddenly, that glorious light on the outskirts of the soul's paradise fades and darkens. and out of the darkness rush the demon pack, the spectral hounds that hunt the souls of sinful men, the evil spirits of the air, implacable, fierce, inexorable tormentors, who chase unhallowed souls that have escaped from fleshly fetters, and drive them back to the prison house of clay. Merciless in pursuit, with hideous howling that only the spirit can hear, they press their agonized quarry. Lower and lower, in that pathless waste of air, the hunted soul descends. And now it is the radiant bulwark of heaven that vanishes from his straining gaze, while the accursed lights of earth are rising through the deep gulf of darkness. He is going back, driven back to the world he scorns. He must live again, suffer again, sin again, wallow in sensuality, agonize in disease, drink once again the bitter draught of human life. He struggles against the awful doom, strives with fast-beating wings to escape his hunters. Again, he soars in trackless space. He feels the glory of the higher life, the power of the disembodied spirit. Distance and time are as nothing. He sees the earth wheel below him. Those exultant wings are carrying him over the tropical forests, the extinct volcanoes, the great rivers, Amazon, Mississippi, Ganges, Indus, over the roof of the world, over the desolate places, over the fertile valleys, over the ice wildernesses of the Arctic and Antarctic seas. All that the earth has of wonder or of beauty rushes past him like a dream picture, and in the midst of the rapturous sense of limitless space, he feels that he is being hunted down, hunted back to the life he loathes. His flapping wings, the sound of demonic voices in his ear tell him that he is beaten. Those hellhounds fill the air. They circle him in and bear him down. Vain as the wheeling of the rook under the swoop of the hawk are those last efforts of the tortured soul. The aerial hounds raise their wild yell of triumph. The glory of the universe shrinks and dwindles to a spot where gaslights gleam redly through a veil of fog. Below, in the mists of evening, and under the smoke of the city, he sees one of the most hideous quarters of the town, a slum in the East End, filthy and loathsome, haunt of the sweater's slaves, the Polish Jew, the British thief. And in one of those courts, reeking with vilest odours, in a garret, poorest where all are poor, a woman lies in the throes of woman's martyrdom, the deserted companion of a felon whom the police are hunting. In the offspring of that hapless mother, child of a murderer and thief, born to a heritage of want and shame, thy soul shall recommence the pilgrimage of life, to expiate, in long years of suffering, among outcasts and criminals, thy life of self-worship and isolation from the brotherhood of man. There is no paradise for the soul that has forgotten man's duty to man. That was the doom which the sickened soul heard in the darkness, as it shrank and dwindled and grew faint and dim, sinking from the heights of intellectual power to the faint consciousness of the newborn child.